Hello everyone, Mr. Dempsey here. Welcome to video 6-3 Evidence for Evolution. And in this video we're going to be looking at the origin of whales and dolphins. Before we delve into that topic, I want you to consider that evolution is both an observable trait, or observable fact rather, and a well-supported scientific theory. As a fact, humans have caused the domestication of dogs from wolves. Bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics. But what if we as humans weren't around to witness that evolution? Can we prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it did happen? Can we use clues to decipher the past? And as we consider that, think about how majestic and enigmatic whales are. Here's a model of a whale heart to scale from a blue whale. And in that plastic model of that heart, a person could actually crawl through one of the blood vessels into one of the chambers of the heart. Whales are also the largest animals to have ever lived on Earth, and you can imagine what people thought about them historically over time. We can get some ideas about that if we look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the Quran, where Jonah is swallowed by a large fish, which is often thought of as a whale. A Japanese character for fish looks like this. Here's the word for whale, and you can see that character for fish actually is part of the word for whale. So if people through time thought of whales as some kind of a strange fish, how can we know what their relationship to other mammals or to other animals is? The way to figure that out is to, let's use an analogy. Imagine that you adopted this girl and you want to know what is her ethnic origin. She seems to share a lot of similarities to this European girl with the blonde hair or the darker skin, such as this African girl. In the same way, this dolphin seems to show a lot of similarity to this shark, and we too may wonder, are they related to each other? Is this a problem we can solve? And the answer absolutely is yes. We can compare DNA. So you've probably heard of kits like 23andMe and ancestry.com. If we were to do a DNA test of this girl, we would find out that she is of Melanesian descent. That means that she is related biologically to other Melanesians. So in addition to that, she also, if we look at this family tree carefully, here are Australians or Austronesians. Those are Aborigines, and she too shares ancestry with them. So she's biologically related to them. So biologically related means to share common ancestry. Consider, for example, that you and your cousin are biologically related. You come from a common ancestor, which is your grandparents. Or you and your second cousin are biologically related, and you come from a common ancestor, which is your great-grandparents. So to be biologically related means to show common ancestry. So if we look at whales and we compare that to other types of animals, we might wonder, what are the closest living relatives to whales and dolphins? You might think manatees or seals, since they look similar, but it turns out it is the hippo. Hippos are more closely related to whales and dolphins than hippos are related to even other types of mammals. And that too suggests that they share common ancestry, or it tells us they share common ancestry. So we have a fact. Hippos and whales and dolphins are biologically related and therefore share a common ancestor. But what that suggests is that whales and dolphins, which look really nothing like hippos, in their evolutionary past may have looked very different. Maybe they once had legs. And that frames our next question. We might wonder, how did cetaceans, whales, and dolphins evolve from a four-legged land mammal? One clue to that is to look at the anatomy of a dolphin, in this case to a shark. And outwardly, they seem to be very similar. As we discussed earlier, for a long time, people believed that dolphins were some type of a fish, as the ancient Greeks did. Aristotle was one of the first people to investigate that. And when he dissected open a dolphin, he found that they have lungs, which, of course, sharks do not. They have gills. And he found other anatomical differences that suggested that dolphins are actually not fish at all. We could look at other features, for example, that their skeleton and the inside of their fins looks also quite different. But if we compare the outward similarity, we might wonder, why do they look so similar? And the topic we're going to be looking at here is called analogy or analogous structures. And if two animals live in a similar type of environment, they can evolve features which might cause them to look similar. So, for example, swimming in water is a very dense medium as opposed to moving on air, and having a more streamlined body may help that animal move more quickly as a sort of a torpedo shape. And maybe that is why they evolved to have that kind of outward appearance. which is the same as that of a shark. However, if we were to look at the anatomy of this flipper and compare that to that of a human, so here's a whale flipper similar to that of a dolphin, we see the similarities between these two seemingly very different creatures. Notice there's one bone here, there's these two bones, and then we have these smaller bones, these longer digits. And we might ask ourselves, is that due to just coincidence, or maybe there's some other reason? Maybe they possibly share common ancestry. And a term that describes that is homology. Homologous structures are inferences that the similarity is due to common ancestry as opposed to coincidence or some other cause. Another clue we could look at is from the hind area of the whale as opposed to the flippers up here. And we look at the back, and normally you wouldn't really see anything. This is buried underneath the blubber and the muscle here, but there are these small bones found back there, and they've been characterized as the pelvis, the femur, tibia. These are the bones of the legs, such as the tibia and femur. And these really serve no function in these whales. They can vary in size and number, and sometimes they are even absent in the same species of whales. And that variability and absence indicates that they really don't serve a function, and the term that describes that are vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are the anatomy of an organism that don't serve a function today, but did sometime in the past. In humans, for example, body hair, goosebumps, wisdom teeth are considered vestigial and don't serve an important function, but did in our ape ancestors. Next, let's look at the next piece of evidence. We're going to be looking at fossils. And so this is one of the first fossil whales discovered back in the 1830s in Alabama. It's named Basilosaurus. At first, people thought it was some kind of a sea reptile, hence the word saurus or reptile. But it turns out that it actually is not. You could see that it seems to have some similarities to dolphins, but even back in the 1800s, anatomists recognized that it has some key characteristics that are only found in whales. Whales have parts of the bones around their ear and the middle bones of the middle ear create a unique structure called the bulla. And that bulla structure is a diagnostic or characteristic feature found in whales. So these basilosaurids, or these extinct whales, have those unique ear bones. Another thing we can see about them that's not whale-like at all is if we look down back here in this area, we see these tiny little legs which are not articulated or connected to the skeleton. If we look at them more clearly, we can notice some similarity to even the bones of our own legs, or to cats and dogs and other typical mammals. Here's the pelvis, the femur, here's the tibia and fibula, and then this is the foot. These fossils are found all around the world, including in Egypt, near the pyramids of Giza. And this is a place, and the English translation is Valley of the Whales. It's a tourist destination for people to actually see these extinct whales out in the desert sands of Egypt. Another group of fossils we could look at, these are called the ambulocetids. These are found around Pakistan, and I'll be looking at those with you in more detail. But one thing we can see is they have much longer leg bones than the basilosaurids did. They also have long toes, indicating they may have had flippers. And a key thing here is the articulation of the leg with the rest of the skeleton. So another group of fossils that are similar to these are called Pachycetus, and they also have those bulla structures I mentioned earlier of the middle ear bones and part of the skull, which makes them very whale-like, and yet they have much more developed legs. Another thing that's interesting about them is the ankle bone found in Pachycetus, shown right here, is very similar. So here's Pachycetus, is very similar to that of a pig, a deer, and hippos. Those animals are called ungulates, even-toed ungulates. And Pachycetus, being whale-like, also has this ungulate type structure, which is similar to that of mammals such as hippos and deer and things like that. So here we're looking at a fossil distribution of these animals over time. Here we looked at Pachycetus, here's Ambulocetus, and I mentioned the Basilosaurids. And so I want you to consider a pause and think question. What do you think is wrong with this depiction? So this is the one I want you to look at. What do you think is wrong with this depiction of whale evolution showing Pachycetus down here on the bottom evolving directly into Ambulocetus, which then evolves into Basilosaurus and then into modern whales? Why is that a misleading view of evolution? And one way that you can think about how that might be the case as a misleading idea is to look at this data over here. So I'm going to pause and stop so you think about that. All right, so let's re-examine our evidence over here. And one thing you'll notice is that these animals are not living in, evolving directly from one to the next. Instead, we see this branching pattern over evolutionary time. It's over like a tree or a bush. And that some of these animals, like Pakicetus, they have a relatively short time span in which they're found as fossils, indicating that they lived and went extinct, whereas other groups seem to persist over millions of years and are more successful perhaps, but eventually too go extinct. But what we're looking at is that there's some more primitive forms that are surviving while there's more advanced creatures that are living at the same time as them. And so instead of thinking of evolution as this direct chain of one evolving to the next, think of this branching idea where you can get creatures that retain primitive features living side by side with those with more advanced features. As a quick example, consider that there are mammals, and we think of mammals as having live birth, but there are some mammals that lay eggs, such as the platypus, the echidna, and you have these creatures with more primitive characteristics living side by side with those with more modern ones. And that's what we're seeing here. So this idea of this direct chain of evolution is really just a misleading one. So if we try to find some trends in evolution, though, can we do that? So here we're looking at some of these creatures we mentioned earlier. So we've got Pakicetus and Ambulocetus. Here's the Durodon, which is a basilosauride. And one of the trends we see is a more streamlined body evolving, where the hind limbs become more and more reduced, such as in the Durodon over here. Another thing I want you to think about, though, is did the skull anatomy change over time? So how did the skull of whales change as they adapted to an increasingly aquatic lifestyle? So I'll pause and have you think for a moment about that, and look carefully here at these skulls and see if you can find any indication of things that change. So one thing that you may notice is if we look at the nasal cavity here of these more extinct, these more primitive whales, you'll see that nasal cavity is at the end of the skull. Over evolutionary time, that nasal cavity migrates to the higher upper parts of the skull until eventually it becomes the blowhole, another adaptation to living in an oceanic environment. So we call these transitional fossils. So we could look at whales of today, which are totally oceanic and sea-dwelling, versus these more primitive types of whales like Pakicetus, which are terrestrial. And we find these sort of intermediates, which have these reduced limb structures in the back and have nasal cavities migrating to the rear of the skull. So these are fossils that show sort of a blend of these traits like this. Next idea is, how do you think scientists can infer if these ancient whales lived in freshwater versus seawater? So can we find that out? So we could do that if we looked at something called isotopes. So you may recall that isotopes are types of atoms that differ in their number of neutrons. Here we're looking at oxygen 18 versus oxygen 16. Oxygen 18 has 2 more neutrons than oxygen 16 and is therefore heavier. And when evaporation happens, oxygen 18 doesn't evaporate as easily. So you have in rainwater and freshwater less oxygen 18 compared to in the ocean. And that's a useful thing to know, because oxygen 18, 16, and these other types of elements get incorporated into the skeletons. In this case, oxygen 18 being more prevalent in animals that live in the ocean, such as oceanic dolphins, and oxygen 18 being less common in freshwater dolphins, like this Chinese river dolphin. So we could use that as a comparison. And let's think of this as a positive control. We're expecting to find high levels of oxygen 18. And this is our negative control. We're expecting to find lower amounts. And that would be sort of a signature of the isotopes in those types of bones and teeth. We compare that to these fossilized whales, and we find animals like this one here, Remingtoceted whales, and they have high levels of oxygen 18 relative to the Pakicetids we saw previously, where there's lower levels of oxygen 18. And that indicates that these pachycetids were living in a more freshwater type of environment, maybe riverbed environments, whereas the Remington-cetids are living more in an oceanic type of environment. So here we see reconstructions of how these animals may have looked. Pachycetids, we have their skeleton we saw earlier, and living in more of a riverine environment. Here's Ambulocetus living in a maybe a delta environment, where the river is emptying into the ocean in sort of a mixture of brackish water. And here we have the Basilosaurids, which are fully oceanic, and yet they still retain these small legs, as we saw previously. So let's look at another topic, biogeography. Biogeography is the study of how species are distributed in geographic space and time. And as an example of that, we might wonder, why are most marsupials concentrated in Australia? Maybe that has something to do with their history, such as maybe the history of plate tectonics and the evolution of that group of mammals. In the same way, we might wonder, can we use biogeography as a way of understanding whale evolution? So if we look at the most primitive whale fossils, like Pachycetus, they're found around Pakistan here and India. We look at later whales that evolve, and we start to see Ambulocetus and related forms living in a more spread out area around the Himalayan area, and also in here you can see in Asia. Later in evolutionary time, the Basilosaurids are found worldwide. And what this suggests is the origin of whales began in this area around Pakistan, India, and over evolutionary time they began to spread. And that's a clue to how they originated. And we see that more visually here. So we have the ancestors of whales sharing common ancestry with hippopotami. And as they evolve, you have some groups that are living in freshwater environments, like Pachycetids. Ambulocetids living in more coastal environments or brackish water along the coastal areas like this. And eventually Basilosaurids, which are fully oceanic. And this is based on their biogeography and, importantly, the isotopes of oxygen 18 that we looked at. Another clue to the evolution of whales, as far as coming from a four-legged ancestor, is to look at their embryos. And so here we have a human and a cat and a dolphin. And you can see that humans and cats have these limb buds clearly. Of course, these develop into our arms, into our legs, same type of thing for cats with 4 limbs. But when you think of a dolphin, you don't think of 4 limbs. They just have 2 front flippers. So it's surprising that dolphins have these leg buds as embryos. If we look at how they develop, or limb buds develop just in generally, there's something called sonic hedgehog. Sonic hedgehog is a signaling gene that causes the development of tissues in the limb, so a full limb develops. But in cetaceans, like whales and dolphins, sonic hedgehog is suppressed, and so therefore the limb never really develops. And in fact, the limb bud, as this embryo, will be reabsorbed back into the tissues as the dolphin develops. But we might ask ourselves, what if somehow sonic hedgehog were not suppressed? Could you get a dolphin that has some kind of a limb bud, or a leg bud, I should say, some type of a back flipper? So believe it or not, that can happen. So here is a dolphin that was caught off the coast in Japan in 2006 by some Japanese fishermen. It was named Haruka, and this here's a close-up of that, and you can see here's this back flipper-like structure. Now it doesn't really function, but it's considered to be an atavism. An atavism is sort of an evolutionary throwback, where there may be genes that are involved in making something. Those genes are turned off, but those genes can be re-expressed if there's some kind of genetic change and mutation that causes that to happen. In humans, for example, atavisms can cause fur in people. This is called congenital hypertrichosis, people with fur. Tails in people, which these tails protrude outside of the body. And extra nipples, similar to that of most mammals, which have multiple nipples going down that kind of ventral side of the body, where people can have extra nipples there as well. So moving on to another form of evidence, let's look at molecular biology. So in this analogy I'm going to start off with, imagine if we could, you know that movies can be stored digitally, first of all, using zeros and ones. And so it's sort of like a Morse code, and so we can take an old movie like this one from the 1800s stored digitally using zeros and ones. But recently, molecular biologists have been able to store movies similar to this one in bacteria. And the reason why that can work is because all cells use DNA, and that code, instead of being binary like zeros and ones, contains these 4 letters of DNA, ATGC. And that is a code of information that can store something like this movie here. So imagine if we were to insert that DNA clip of that movie into some ancestor. And so over time, as that group of organisms evolves, it passes on that movie clip to its descendants. And potentially that movie could mutate and change over time. So wouldn't it be amazing if we could do that? And it turns out there is something like that. They're called signs or short interspersed nuclear elements. And they're sort of like these evolution trackers. And so what happens is these non-coding pieces of DNA can jump through the genome. They're called transposons or jumping genes. And as they do that, they can mutate and change. So as an example of how that works, imagine that our evolutionary tracker sign here mutates. And all the descendants of that group inherits that mutation. And let's say another mutation happens here. Here we got Garfield. And that trait would be, that genetic change would be passed on to those descendants. So by comparing signs between different groups of organisms, scientists can see that hippos and whales share a lot of these sign signatures, indicating that they share a common ancestor. They share many of those evolutionary trackers in common. Another thing we could look at is the idea that genes can become fossilized or become vestigial. So here we're looking at a test that's done for people that are colorblind, and if you can see the number 6 here, that's good. You are not colorblind, but most mammals would not be able to see that. They have dichromatic vision, unlike us, we have trichromatic vision. And so a dog and a cat, they can't distinguish between red and green like this, and so they wouldn't be able to see the difference. So it turns out, you might wonder, are cetaceans like whales and dolphins, are they like most mammals, which are dichromatic, like cats and dogs? So to understand that, here we see a column of ocean water, and as the sunlight penetrates through that column of ocean water, you can see that many of the wavelengths of light are getting screened out by that water. And so as you go down deeper and deeper, the only wavelength that makes it down that far is blue light. So for example, violet gets screened out. So here we're looking at a gene sequence from a cow and comparing that to a dolphin. And you can see there's a lot of places where those bases match. But there are some places, like here's a missing base, a deletion. Over here we have another missing base and 4 bases missing. What this causes is a frameshift mutation, causing that gene to be no longer functioning. And so scientists consider these as pseudogenes, or almost vestigial genes. Genes that may have served some function in the animal in the past, but no longer serve a function today. And you can see that there would be a selective pressure, or a selective relaxation of selection in this case, where if you have an animal that may have had dichromatic vision in the past, but it's living in an environment where there's only one wavelength of light, there's no longer a selective advantage to being able to distinguish violet anymore. So if that gene mutates, there's no downside to that animal, such as with dolphins. And so that doesn't make any difference for them to no longer be dichromatic, since they only have access to one wave of light. And so they can still see blue light down here, but they can no longer see violet. That gene has now been mutated. So that is called a pseudogene. So if we look at, add up all the evidence here, consider that scientific theories have explanatory power. They can make sense of unrelated facts, such as these here. So we have independent lines of evidence. These are forms of evidence that are different from each other, but can be understood in the light of evolution. So for example, the anatomy. When we looked at whales and compared those to humans, for example, we see a similar arrangement of the bones of the arm of a human, or the bat of a wing, to the flipper of a whale. And that indicates common ancestry, some kind of ancestor that may have had that same bone arrangement. We also saw vestigial structures where whales have these small bones in the back, which no longer really serve a function, like the femur, for example. We also looked at transitional fossils, where we saw that the hind limbs of whales become smaller and smaller over time, and that the nasal cavity migrates back to become a blowhole. We looked at biogeography, and we saw that the ancestry of whales at first is concentrated around Pakistan and India, and over evolutionary time those later whales start to spread out into all parts of the world. And that information is corroborated by the isotope data, which shows that those early whales were living in more freshwater environments and then eventually spread to becoming more marine, as indicated by option 18. Embryology and development, we saw that whales have suppression of sonic hedgehog, so they no longer form their back limbs, but a mutation that can cause a emergence of at least a partial limb, and that's known as an atavism, or an evolutionary throwback. And finally, we've looked at molecular biology with signs, which are like these evolutionary trackers, where we can find sequences of non-coding DNA spread through a group of organisms, and by looking at similar sign sequences, scientists are able to find evolutionary relationships between them, such as between whales and hippos. And we also looked at pseudogenes found in whales, showing that they have lost the function of certain genes, such as dichromatic vision, and that some of those genes are no longer functioning. So here is an evolutionary tree, which gives us our model of how all this adds up. So here we have toothed whales like dolphins and sperm whales, baleen whales. Here are some extinct forms we didn't look at, but we did talk about some of these early groups like Pakicetus and Ambulocetus and these basilosaurids. And we see this evolutionary trend over time of a more and more aquatic lifestyle, leading to smaller limbs, nasal cavities moving back, all these things. So then we've looked at what whales evolved from in terms of common ancestors. We saw that hippos and whales are biologically related to each other and share a common ancestor. We looked at how and where that evolution happened. The ancestors of whales evolved after the extinction of ichthyosaurs, beginning about 50 million years ago along the Tethys Sea, now Pakistan. But we didn't really look at why this occurred. And so if we go back to the Mesozoic era, there were no whales, there were no dolphins, no evidence of them. But there were these marine reptiles that lived at that time. And you can see that these animals look surprisingly like whales, except anatomically, inside of looking at their structures of their bones, very different. In fact, these reptiles went through a similar evolutionary progression that whales and dolphins did, becoming adapted to a more and more aquatic lifestyle. That all ended 66 million years ago when a meteorite hit the Earth and caused one of the largest mass extinctions of all time, where 70% of all species go extinct. What that did is it opened up new niches for potential survivors of that extinction, such as certain mammals. And so the extinction of ichthyosaurs and other reptiles led to the evolution of mammals like whales that filled that niche. Here's a depiction of that. And so with that extinction, you have a group of legged animals related to hippos diversify into these modern cetaceans we see, hippos being their relatives. That type of evolution happened right here. This is 50 million years ago, and based on what we know about plate tectonics. And India at that time was an island continent similar to Australia. And this sea area, called the Tethys Sea, is the place in which we see this early evolution of whales taking place. So here is a depiction of this, where we're looking at this type of evolution. So as I was mentioning, we know what the ancestors of whales were, which is that of relatives of hippos. We know how and where this evolution took place, which is this Tethys Sea area here. And so from all of this, we're able to get this larger idea of the evolution of whales. We can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this evolution happened. But keep in mind that as a scientific theory, evolution also helps us make predictions and ask questions. It helps scientists consider, for example, maybe how did echolocation evolve in whales? Are there similar patterns to how bats evolved that ability? How did whales evolve baleen? Is there a genetic toolkit that was changed that caused hair to become baleen? So evolutionary theories like this are able to be tested with future experiments, but they give us a way to understand those questions. So thanks for watching, and keep being curious.